She was just the quiet woman who used the treadmill every morning before the real soldiers showed up. They called her base wife, joked about her perfect form, never bothered learning her name. Until the day a bar fight turned deadly, and Sarah Mitchell moved with precision that made hardened Rangers step back in shock. Welcome to Secrets Never Told. Before we begin this powerful story of hidden strength and forgotten valor, tell me in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button and help us honor those who served in ways we never knew. The gym at Fort Benning opened its doors at 0500 hours sharp, but Sarah Mitchell was always there 10 minutes early, waiting in the pre-dawn darkness beside her weathered Honda Civic. At 42, she moved with the measured efficiency of someone who understood that every minute mattered. Every routine had purpose. She wore the same outfit every morning: faded gray sweatpants, a loose-fitting army t-shirt from the post exchange, and running shoes that had seen better days. Her dark hair, streaked with premature silver, was always pulled back in a functional ponytail. Nothing about her appearance suggested anything beyond the ordinary. Just another military spouse trying to stay in shape while her husband deployed. The base gym was Sarah's sanctuary, but only during those quiet morning hours before the active duty personnel arrived for their mandatory PT session. She preferred the solitude, the rhythm of her own breathing, the steady thump of her feet on the treadmill. By 6:30, she'd be gone, disappeared back into whatever domestic routine the other gym users assumed filled her days. Staff Sergeant Mike Torres was usually the first soldier to arrive, leading the early morning crowd that filtered in around 0630. A 28-year-old Ranger with deployment experience in Afghanistan, Torres carried himself with the confident swagger that came from proven combat experience. He'd noticed the quiet woman countless times over the past 18 months, always finishing her workout just as his began. "Morning, ma'am," he'd nod politely as she gathered her towel and water bottle. Sarah would respond with a brief smile and an even briefer "Good morning, Sergeant," before heading for the exit. It was the extent of their interaction, a ritual as routine as her workout itself. Torres's buddies had their own theories about the mystery woman. Corporal Danny Reeves, a stocky kid from Tennessee, was convinced she was a colonel's wife, killing time while her husband worked late hours at headquarters. Private First Class Jackson, barely 20 and fresh from infantry training, thought she might be a nurse from the base hospital trying to stay fit for 12-hour shifts. "She's got perfect form on everything," PFC Martinez observed one morning, toweling sweat from his face after a brutal circuit training session. "You see how she runs? No wasted motion, like she actually knows what she's doing." "Yeah, well, officers' wives usually have personal trainers," Torres replied dismissively. "Money talks, you know. Probably spends more on fitness than we make in a month." The assumption felt natural enough. Fort Benning hosted plenty of military families, and the wives of senior officers often maintained fitness routines that put younger soldiers to shame. Sarah's quiet competence in the gym didn't seem particularly remarkable to men who were focused on their own demanding training schedules. But Sergeant First Class Tom Anderson, a 34-year-old veteran with 3 combat deployments and an eye for details that had kept him alive overseas, had noticed things that others missed. The way Sarah checked corners when she entered the gym, how she positioned herself with clear sight lines to all exits, the controlled breathing patterns that suggested advanced training, not casual fitness routine. "You ever talk to her?" Anderson asked Torres one morning after Sarah had completed her usual routine and departed. "Just pleasantries." Torres shrugged. "Why? There's something about her. The way she moves, the way she watches. Reminds me of someone who's been in the shit, you know?" Torres laughed. "Come on, Sergeant. She's probably some accountant's wife from Columbus. You're seeing ghosts where there aren't any." But Anderson's instincts, honed by years of identifying threats in hostile environments, told him there was more to Sarah Mitchell than anyone realized. He'd survived multiple tours precisely because he paid attention to details that others overlooked, and something about this woman triggered those same survival instincts. Sarah, for her part, was content to remain invisible. She'd chosen Fort Benning specifically because it was large enough to disappear into, busy enough that one more military spouse wouldn't attract attention. Her husband, Captain David Mitchell, was a logistics officer whose deployment schedule kept him overseas for 8 months of every year. It was the perfect cover for someone who needed to stay off certain radars while maintaining the appearance of normal military family life. The arrangement worked well for both of them. David asked no questions about her past, and Sarah asked no questions about why a logistics officer needed to be gone so frequently on missions that weren't discussed at dinner parties. Their marriage was built on mutual respect and carefully maintained boundaries, exactly what both of them needed after careers that had demanded more than most people could imagine. The morning routine continued undisturbed for weeks. Sarah would complete her workout in solitude, exchange exchange brief pleasantries with the arriving soldiers, and vanish into her day. It was a rhythm that suited everyone involved, a comfortable routine that might have continued indefinitely if not for the events of October 12th. That morning began like any other. Sarah arrived at 0450, completed her usual warm-up stretches, and settled into her 40-minute cardio routine. She was halfway through when the gym's front door burst open with unusual force. Instead of the measured arrival of soldiers reporting for PT, 3 men stumbled through the entrance, clearly not military personnel, clearly intoxicated, and clearly looking for trouble. The base gym was technically open to all military personnel and their families, but these men didn't fit either category. They wore civilian clothes that reeked of alcohol and cigarettes, their movements unsteady but aggressive. The largest of the 3, a heavily built man with prison tattoos covering his forearms, immediately began examining the weight equipment with the proprietary interest of someone marking territory. "This'll work," he announced to his companions, his voice loud enough to echo through the mostly empty facility. "Got everything we need right here." Sarah slowed her pace on the treadmill, her attention shifting from her workout to the developing situation. Every instinct she'd developed over years of training told her these men didn't belong here, and their behavior suggested they weren't planning to leave quietly. The second man, wiry and nervous with darting eyes, began checking the gym's windows and doors. "Nobody else around?" he asked. "Just the jogger," the third man replied, nodding towards Sarah without bothering to lower his voice. "She ain't gonna be a problem." Sarah maintained her steady pace, but her mind was already shifting into a different mode of operation. She'd learned long ago that the best way to handle a developing threat was to appear as non-threatening as possible while gathering intelligence and planning response options. These men were clearly not here for a workout, and their casual discussion of her presence suggested they viewed her as either an asset or a liability. Neither option was good. The large man moved toward the weight area and began selecting dumbbells, testing their heft with the practiced motions of someone familiar with violence. "This one should do the job," he said, holding up a 40-pound weight. "Quick and quiet." That's when Sarah understood this wasn't a robbery or a random break-in. These men were here for a specific purpose, and from their conversation, that purpose involved violence. Her presence had complicated their plans, but they'd clearly decided she wasn't a significant threat. They were about to discover how wrong that assumption was. Sarah continued her treadmill routine while covertly assessing the situation. 3 men, all armed with improvised weapons from the gym equipment. The large one was clearly the leader, probably ex-military from his posture and tactical awareness. The nervous one was likely the lookout, responsible for monitoring approaches and escape routes. The third man seemed to be following orders, less initiative, but probably more dangerous if cornered. At 0625, the gym's main lights flickered on as the facility prepared for the morning rush of military personnel. The 3 intruders moved with sudden urgency, clearly expecting their window of opportunity to close quickly. "Time to go," the leader announced. "Grab what we came for and get out." But instead of heading for the exit, they moved deeper into the gym, toward the office area where the facility's safe was located. Sarah realized these weren't random criminals. They had inside information about the gym's operations, probably from someone who knew the staff routines and security procedures. As if summoned by her thoughts, Sergeant Torres pushed through the front entrance right on schedule for his 0630 workout. He was focused on his phone, checking messages from his unit, and didn't immediately notice the 3 men who'd frozen at his arrival. The situation escalated in seconds. The leader grabbed Torres from behind, one arm around his throat, the other brandishing the dumbbell as a weapon. The sergeant's training kicked in immediately, but he was caught off guard and off balance, unable to bring his full strength to bear against his attacker. "Nobody moves, nobody gets hurt," the leader announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to violence. "This is just business." Sarah had stopped running, but she remained on the treadmill, hands visible, posture non-threatening. To the 3 criminals, she looked exactly like what they'd expected, a frightened civilian who would comply with orders and forget what she'd seen. Torres struggled against the chokehold, his face darkening as his air supply was restricted. "Let him go," Sarah said quietly. "This doesn't have to get worse." "Lady, shut up and face the wall," the nervous one snapped, pointing at her with shaking hands. "This ain't your business." "You're right," Sarah replied, stepping down from the treadmill with deliberate slowness. "It's not my business, but you're making it my business by hurting people." The leader tightened his grip on Torres, who was beginning to lose consciousness. "I said this was just business. Don't make it personal." Sarah took a step forward, her hands still visible but her posture subtly changing. "It became personal when you decided to kill a soldier in front of me." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across the leader's face. Something in Sarah's tone, her calm confidence in the face of immediate danger, didn't match the profile of a helpless bystander. "Back off, lady," lady, he warned. I don't want to hurt you, but I will if you force my hand. Sarah took another step forward. You're going to let him go, and then you're going to leave. This is your only chance to walk away. The nervous lookout laughed harshly. You think you're some kind of hero? Lady, there's 3 of us and 1 of you. Do the math. Sarah's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes shifted. For just a moment, the mask she'd worn for 18 months slipped, and the 3 criminals found themselves looking at someone who'd seen violence they couldn't imagine and survived experiences they couldn't comprehend. I have done the math, she said quietly, and you don't want to see the results. What happened next took less than 10 seconds, but it unfolded with the precision of someone who'd trained for exactly this scenario countless times, under conditions far more challenging than a base gymnasium. Sarah moved forward and to her right, using the angle to break the leader's line of sight with his accomplices. Her first strike was a precise blow to his wrist, forcing him to release the dumbbell while simultaneously loosening his grip on Torres. Her second strike was an elbow to his solar plexus, delivered with enough force to double him over, gasping. Torres dropped to his knees, gulping air, as Sarah spun to face the other 2 attackers. The nervous one was reaching for something in his jacket, probably a knife, but Sarah closed the distance before he could draw the weapon. A knee strike to his midsection followed by a controlled takedown left him unconscious on the gym floor. The third attacker had more time to react, grabbing a barbell and swinging it at Sarah's head with enough force to cause serious injury. Sarah ducked under the swing, swept his legs, and used his own momentum to slam him face first into the weight rack. He joined his unconscious partner on the floor. The entire encounter was over before Torres had fully recovered his breath. When he looked up, Sarah was standing calmly in the center of the gym, surrounded by 3 unconscious criminals, her breathing barely elevated from the exertion. You okay, Sergeant? She asked, extending a hand to help him to his feet. Torres stared at her for a long moment, his mind struggling to process what he'd just witnessed. Who the hell are you? Sarah met his gaze steadily. Sarah Mitchell. I live in base housing, Unit 247-B. My husband is Captain David Mitchell, currently deployed with the 82nd Airborne. That's not what I meant, Torres replied, getting to his feet without assistance. What I just saw, that wasn't self-defense class at the community center. That was combat training, military combat training. Before Sarah could respond, the gym's front door opened and Sergeant First Class Anderson entered, followed by 2 other soldiers from their unit. They stopped short when they saw the scene. 3 unconscious men on the floor, Torres disheveled and breathing hard, and Sarah standing in the middle of it all looking like she'd just finished her morning stretches. What happened here? Anderson asked, his eyes taking in every detail of the situation. Torres looked at Sarah, then back at his sergeant. These 3 guys jumped me when I came in. Mrs. Mitchell? She handled it. Anderson's gaze focused on Sarah with new intensity. Handled it how? She put all 3 of them down in about 10 seconds, Torres replied, still processing what he'd witnessed. I've never seen anything like it. Anderson approached Sarah slowly, his trained eye cataloging details he'd missed during their previous brief encounters. Her stance, her breathing, the way she tracked movement in her peripheral vision. Everything about her screamed advanced military training. Ma'am, he said carefully, what's your background? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, weighing her options. 18 months of careful anonymity had just evaporated in 10 seconds of necessary action. She could lie, deflect, try to minimize what these soldiers had witnessed, or she could accept that some secrets were meant to surface when lives were at stake. Sergeant, I need you to make some phone calls, she said finally. The first one is to base security to report this incident. The second one is to Colonel Harrison in Special Operations Command. Tell him Sarah Mitchell needs to speak with him immediately. What should I tell him it's about? Anderson asked. Sarah rolled up her left sleeve, revealing a faded tattoo that made all 3 soldiers go silent. It wasn't flashy or decorative, just a simple ranger tab with a number beneath it that none of them recognized, but all of them understood, represented something extraordinary. Tell him Ghost 6 is breaking cover, she said quietly. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of sirens approaching as base security responded to Anderson's call. Sarah stood calmly in the center of the gym, surrounded by evidence of capabilities she'd hoped never to reveal, while 3 career soldiers stared at her with expressions of dawning understanding. Ghost 6. Even Anderson, with his extensive special operations experience, had only heard whispers of that designation. It belonged to the classified world of operators who existed in the spaces between official records, soldiers whose missions were so sensitive that their very existence was compartmentalized beyond normal security protocols. Torres found his voice first. You were special operations. I was a lot of things, Sarah replied. Most of them classified at levels that don't officially exist. But you're a woman, PFC Martinez said. Then immediately immediately looked embarrassed by his own words. Sarah's expression didn't change. "Yes, I am," which should tell you something about when and why my service record was classified. Anderson understood immediately. Women hadn't been officially allowed in Ranger units during the time frame her tattoo suggested, which meant Sarah had been part of something even more restricted. Experimental programs that pushed boundaries the military wasn't ready to acknowledge publicly. Base security arrived in force, followed closely by military police and medical personnel. As the unconscious criminals were secured and processed, Colonel Harrison himself appeared at the gym entrance. A tall man with silver hair and the bearing of someone who'd spent decades in special operations. Harrison took one look at the scene and immediately began clearing non-essential personnel from the area. "Sergeant Anderson, I need your report," Harrison said crisply. "What happened here?" Anderson provided a concise account of what he'd witnessed and what Torres had reported. Throughout his report, Harrison's eyes remained fixed on Sarah, who stood quietly beside the treadmill where her morning routine had been interrupted. "Mrs. Mitchell," Harrison said when Anderson finished, "we need to talk." "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, the automatic response of someone whose military training ran deeper than her civilian cover story. As they moved toward the gym office for privacy, Torres called out, "Ma'am?" Sarah turned back. "Thank you for saving my life." Sarah nodded once, then disappeared into the office with Colonel Harrison, leaving 3 soldiers standing in a gym that would never feel quite the same again. 2 hours later, after interviews, security debriefings, and phone calls to agencies that didn't advertise their existence, Sarah emerged from the gym office to find the 3 soldiers waiting for her by the entrance. Their morning PT session had been canceled, but they'd remained at the scene, drawn by curiosity and something deeper, the recognition that they'd witnessed something extraordinary. "Ma'am," Anderson said as she approached, "can we ask you something?" Sarah paused, her car keys in her hand. "Depends on the question. Were you really Ghost 6? Sarah looked at the 3 men, young soldiers who dedicated their lives to serving their country, who understood sacrifice and duty, even if they'd never been asked to disappear entirely for their mission. They deserved an answer, even if she couldn't give them the whole truth. "Ghost 6 was a call sign," she said finally, "used by various personnel across multiple classified programs. I was one of them, but that's not who I am anymore." "What are you now?" Torres asked. Sarah smiled for the first time since the incident began. "Now I'm just Sarah Mitchell, military spouse, who likes to use the treadmill in the morning before the real soldiers show up for PT." But as she drove home through the familiar streets of Fort Benning, Sarah understood that her quiet anonymity was over. Colonel Harrison had made it clear that her cover wasn't blown. Her past would remain classified. Her official records would continue to reflect her civilian status. But the 3 soldiers who'd witnessed her in action would carry questions that couldn't be easily answered. More importantly, she'd proven to herself that despite 18 months of domestic routine, the skills that had made her Ghost 6 hadn't diminished. When faced with a threat to innocent life, she'd responded with the same precision and effectiveness that had made her valuable to programs that officially didn't exist. That evening, as she prepared dinner in her base housing kitchen, Sarah reflected on the morning's events. Her husband David would return from deployment in 6 weeks, and she would have to decide how much to tell him about the day his quiet military wife had briefly become someone else entirely. But for now, she was content to return to her routine. Tomorrow morning at 0450, she would be waiting beside her Honda Civic for the gym to open. She would complete her workout, nod politely to any soldiers who arrived early, and disappear back into her day. The only difference would be the way those soldiers looked at her now, with the recognition that sometimes the most dangerous people in the room are the ones who look like they belong there least. Because Ghost 6 had taught her that the best operators are the ones nobody sees coming, and Sarah Mitchell had spent 18 months perfecting the art of being nobody at all, until the moment when being somebody was the only thing that mattered.